This is a phenomenal session that we have queued up for us here today. This is my favorite session generally of this event, where we get to talk about hard policy. It is certainly for the politically minded amongst us. This is going to be an in-depth conversation about what's happened over the past year in the policy landscape for on-chain giving and just in general for the crypto industry. As we talked about in the kickoff keynote, this is become the focus of the space, and we think it is so important for folks to stay on top of what's happening here, and also to translate this into human. I think sometimes this can get stuck in lawyer or in politician language. And so we have people here with us today who are super, super, super well equipped to help translate for us what's happening. We'll hear all these different acronyms throughout the year, SAB and the SEC and the CFTC, and what about all of these different rulemaking three-letter organizations. And I think what we like to do here is to say, okay, part of on-chain giving is being an activist for the proliferation of this tooling and making sure that this innovation can happen in our communities here in the United States. And we are joined today by two people who I see so far, and hopefully a third, Darin as well, will hopefully be joining us, although maybe Darin's here, I just don't see them yet. And we are joined today by Sarah and Tara. And other than having awesome rhyming names, they are each very impressive in their own right. Sarah heads policy at the Blockchain Association. The Blockchain Association is a 501c6, C4? C6.
Six, yeah.
Six. It's a lobbying organization that works with policymakers on the Hill and in local legislatures to make sure that effective policy is being created for the crypto industry. Endowment is a proud member of the Blockchain Association, and just so excited to have Sarah here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we are also joined by Tara Burchmore, who works for Senator Gillibrand's office. Senator Gillibrand is a Democrat senator from New York. She is the senior ranking senator, I believe. No, Chuck Schumer would be that, right? No, she's the junior senator.
Junior senator, but I just would like to clarify, I am a Tech Congress fellow, so I don't technically work for the senator. I am paid by a nonprofit fellowship program that places people with tech backgrounds and tech interests in offices around the Hill. So very excited to be working with the senator's team, but I am a fellow in the office.
Well, it's great to have you nonetheless, Tara, and it's so cool, and maybe it would be great for you, just as a part of this conversation, to explain some of the work that the nonprofit does to help make sure that our legislature and our representatives are informed about what's going on with different technological advancements. But I want to start with Sarah. Sarah, last year, we spent a lot of time talking about regulatory enforcement actions that are happening around the space that were just sort of kicking off, or kind of this current wave of enforcement actions was just getting started. And I'm wondering if you can give us just kind of like a ranking on 0 to 10 of what is the temperature that regulators are putting on the industry today, and where has it been over the last year?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in general, I don't think that too much of the regulatory enforcement pressure has let up. I think we are still seeing many enforcement actions come through, especially from the SEC, but we've also seen some settlements and other actions from the CFTC. SEC being our securities regulator, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the CFTC being our commodities regulator, which is the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. So between the two of those, I'd say they have the bulk. We've seen a few criminal enforcement actions as well, or criminal actions rather, from the Department of Justice and others. So I don't think that's slowing down per se, but I do think that we are starting to see more offensive litigation on behalf of the industry. So there are new litigants who are taking cases in order to help protect the industry better and be more proactive, not just reactive to the different types of enforcement actions that are coming through, and to try to get some good case law and precedent put into the court system. So there are quite a few of those cases that have been brought this year. I think that's kind of a new trend that we're seeing. And beyond that, I think the regulators are starting to see Congress wake up and be more engaged, I think, in the dialogue about how we're regulating the industry. And so I think because of that, that's also starting to shape some of the ways that they're approaching enforcement as well, in the ways that they're considering the different actions they take and how those might play into pending legislation.
You know, focusing for a minute on the Wells notices that we've seen in the space, I'm curious to gauge, you know, the strength of the cases that both, you know, that we've seen Uniswap put forward, and kind of like what would you rate as the sort of prognosis for these DeFi businesses that are taking the scrutiny right now? You know, what is the likelihood that we see the SEC succeed in some of these enforcement actions as they go to court?
Yeah, I think it really depends on who the judge is and the case, the facts of the case, which is kind of a lawyer answer. I'm not a lawyer, but I do think it is a somewhat case-by-case basis that we've seen certain judges who are willing to take a blank slate approach to the way that they view crypto and its role in finance, especially compared to how different types of different, like, a few older judges, for instance, I think take a more traditional view of what a security is and are more willing to listen to the SEC's interpretation of the Howey test, for instance, which they've been using to determine what types of tokens are securities and not. For that reason, I think it's a little bit of a case-by-case basis. And I do think that there are some courts like the Fifth Circuit in Texas, which tend to be a little more light on the regulatory touch compared to the Second District Court, which is up here in New York, where I think that they're a little more willing to listen to the SEC's interpretation of tests. So it kind of depends also on where the case is brought. So I think it's up in the air, but I think in general, DeFi is a really hard topic for courts and for legislators to wrap their heads around. I think it uses a brand new technology. It's lots of new terminology to try to understand, and it really flies in the face of what traditional finance does. So I think it takes a lot to wrap your head around exactly how it operates, and then try to, you know, apply existing case law to those new facts and circumstances.
That makes sense. I think, you know, the hope here is that we see rulemaking happen and laws passed that help provide clarity. And you know, this year we saw a couple of different bills come up for consideration. And Tara, I want to pass the conversation to you. I'm curious, you know, can you walk us through the main pieces of legislation here and tell us a little bit about what is, you know, just refresh our memory, because we talked about this last year, but refresh our memory on the stablecoin bill and the market structure bill, and kind of where we're seeing major legislative efforts that would help remedy some of these enforcement actions, or at least clarify whether these enforcement actions should even be brought or not.
Yeah, sure. Happy to chat about that. So I think the market structure bill that you're talking about is passed the House this year, which is really exciting. And that's the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act. And that bill came out of the House Financial Services Committee and the House Agriculture Committee. And it was just like overall clear functional federal requirements over digital asset market. So designed to do consumer protections, regulatory clarity, just kind of like more common sense regulation to try and push it through to make digital assets a viable part of the US economy and operate here safely. On the Senate side, the Gillibrand Payment Stablecoin Act was released in April of this year, and it's a framework for stablecoins specifically, not a broader project, just stablecoins specifically.
So when you look at these two legislative efforts, is there a comparison to be made between early internet regulation and where we are now with digital asset regulation? And should we be thinking of these things as like similar to the internet in the mid-90s? I guess this question could go to both of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Tara, and then Sarah, you can take that question.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison to draw because, like Sarah said, like these are both the internet and the way we're viewing digital assets now. They're like brand new tech that's influencing people and impacting people's lives. So it is like it's a very interesting comparison to draw. I think one key difference is that a lot of members of Congress first found out about the crypto industry from a financial meltdown through the FTX situation. I don't know if that's how most politicians found out about the internet when it was first getting started. And I think it presents a really different scenario and way you're talking to politicians. Honestly, some people are, I think, afraid of this industry or intimidated by it. And I'm not sure if that was the way the internet was approaching its initial regulation. But I do think both industries sort of have a similar like move fast and break things ethos, which doesn't always align with policymaking. And I think that organizations like Sarah's and a lot of players in the space are really trying to be in good faith and work with legislators, with regulators, and try and put forward good policy in this space.
Sarah, same question to you. How do you think about this in context of other internet regulation? And is it helpful to even think of it that way, or should we treat it as something totally separate?
I think we're facing a technology with blockchain that has the potential to change our lives in many different ways. And I think the internet did the same. And legislators in the 90s had the foresight to allow the internet industry to grow within the United States and really foster the innovation here. And I think that's been one of the greatest economic successes in modern times. We've got companies like Google, Amazon, et cetera, who I think are really taking control of the space and have brought a lot of good to our lives. I think similarly in crypto, we have the potential to create a lot of change and innovation in the space but it's still a nascent sector. So I think what would be best is for legislators and regulators alike to provide clarity while still allowing the space for the industry to build and experiment in similar ways to they did in the 90s for the internet.
We hear so much about, the important thing is to provide clarity. And I think for both of you, you'll have great answers to this question, which is like, what does clarity look like? Right? Like when you think, Tara, about your time as a fellow with Senator Gillibrand, what do you think are the big questions that we're going to be able to answer with legislation? And will that be enough? Is that clarity? And Sarah, for you, like, when you think about, okay, we get stablecoin legislation through, we get past these enforcement actions against Coinbase and Uniswap, we get FIT21 and a market structure bill. Is that clarity? Is that the end? Is it time for us to be like, okay, great, we can go off and keep working? What does clarity look like? And what should we consider the next major milestone? I'll start with you, Sarah. I feel like you're going to have a really interesting perspective here.
I think there are a few major questions that need to be answered. And I say that because of the way that the US regulatory structure is set up. We have two financial regulators, one oversees securities and one oversees commodities. For that reason, we really need to understand what tokens belong under which regulator in order to move forward. So I think the first question that needs to be answered is whether a token is a security or a commodity and under which circumstances. Related to that, I think there's a huge portion of our industry that is not at all related to financial applications. And I think another really big part of clarity, particularly as it applies to legislation and when it's being drafted, is carving out the space and or narrowing it, depending on how you look at it, so that we're focusing legislation and tailoring it to specific needs. So if we're trying to do market structure regulation, which is trying to figure out who is the appropriate regulator between the SEC and CFTC, what tokens fall in what buckets, that's mostly a finance question, but we still need to create space and make sure that we're not accidentally bringing in non-financial applications of blockchain and digital assets into a finance piece of legislation. So creating that kind of clarity, I think, and distinction is really important. And then I think beyond that, there will be lots of rulemaking to be done because many of these laws have broad strokes. They will tell an agency to create rules on how to actually implement the law. So I think those create many opportunities for the public and for industry participants like Blockchain Association to provide comment and try to, fine tune the details of what regulation looks like.
Cool. I hope we answer those questions. Tara, do you agree with that? Are there other questions that you think are kind of missing from that assessment of what clarity will look like?
I think Sarah gave a wonderful answer, and I think her point that this is beyond just a financial sector is a really good one. A lot of the legislation that we're working on right now focuses on financial applications of blockchain technology, of digital assets. Not all, but that's a lot of the things that are moving and the things that are getting attention. I think that her point, Sarah's point, and just it is the fact that there are a lot of non-financial applications in this space that needs to be a consideration in all of these policy conversations. I also think because we have seen a lot of enforcement actions from federal agencies, I think that regulatory clarity would be legislation that allows people to know where the rules are and where the lines are drawn, rather than letting regulatory battles fight out in the courts to draw the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's about it for me. I also do want to flag that Darin has joined.
Yes, I did see Darin join, and it's a great segue because I think, Darin, this hits on so much of the work that you do. Welcome, Darin Carter from Coinbase and their advocacy team. Darin's whole role, full-time role, is to increase education, understanding, and to advocate with local communities, legislatures, representatives, lawmakers about the use cases here. And so Darin, maybe you can kind of pick this ball up that we were dribbling around over the last couple minutes, which is like, what does clarity look like? And how do you shape your advocacy work to try and at least put down a foundation of understanding about what's going on here? Like, what does that look like? What does that clarity look like? And how do you get people to start holding it in their hands?
Absolutely. And pleasure to be here. Sarah, Tara have done an amazing job so far as like framing this discussion, and apologies for the technical difficulties. I think clarity, as we are alluding to, is something that's going to evolve over time. And I believe the nature of policy is usually pretty reactive. So we have this emerging opportunity in blockchain. Unfortunately, a lot of policymakers first discovered this via headlines and epic collapse. And now that actually creates an opportunity for our policymakers to step in, propose common sense legislation that at least addresses some of the things that are glaring right now. We need consumer protections and disclosures and clarity over what should be regulated under Entity A, SEC versus CFTC. And maybe even, it could involve, again, over time, because the nature of this is the fact that not all of these assets or tokens are financial instruments in nature. And there are a lot of other use cases that are still crypto that have nothing to do with any financial application there. So I think that don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Like, we have an opportunity here to advance consumer protections, to drive clarity on at least that aspect of it. And then as you start to dive deeper into crypto and you talk about what is the nature of this token, the governance token, or the financial instrument, or so on and so forth, there's room for policy to evolve over time. And I think it's really important that we actually create that sandbox and that environment here in the United States to just see how that develops. And obviously policy will come in, reacting to certain things or bolstering consumer protections where we think it's needed, or the appropriate disclosures whenever required.
Darin, I want to stay with you for a second. You mentioned something that Tara also brought up earlier, which is that a lot of lawmakers found out about crypto by virtue of very negative news, And I'm curious for you, like, how do you structure programming? And almost at like its simplest level, what does positive educational programming look like for policymakers? Like, what are you talking to them about?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And a lot of the work that we do, at least on my grassroots team, is to try and humanize the industry and also make policymakers makers be aware of the fact that their constituents are not only owners of crypto tokens, but also builders in this industry. Some of the favorite use cases that I've seen have nothing to do with anything financial. It might be on-chain impact. It might be leveraging blockchain for privacy and security of your healthcare records. It might be more equal distribution or transparent distribution of funds. These are all the use cases that are really palatable to policymakers. And I think what we can do to really advance the industry is to help promote more positive use cases like that, like talk them up. So policymakers have like a well-rounded understanding of the potential of this technology. I think crypto falls victim to the idea that we want to come in and just be crypto first. But we can also make a lot of inroads if we were impact first. And we talked about crypto in the background and the impact in the foreground.
It's so great the work that you guys are doing, Darin, and we're so appreciative of it, and really the work that all three of you are doing. And yet, our industry seems to be consumed by partisanship. It's like there's a thread that many in the crypto space are holding on to, that crypto is bipartisan. And I want the entire panel here to kind of explain to me why it's become such a sort of polarizing topic to be pro-crypto. And, you know, while it has become somewhat more of like a tool for partisan politics, like, what are the things that still give you hope here that this is not really just a tool for partisan politics? And maybe I'll start with Sarah there, because I feel like, I don't know, we haven't heard from you in a minute, Sarah, and I'm curious.
It's a really interesting topic. I'm still of the belief that it is mostly bipartisan. I think with former President Trump coming out as very strongly pro-crypto recently, speaking at the Bitcoin Nashville conference a few weeks ago, I think that has created a lot more discussion about who falls in what camp. But I don't think it's really about who falls in what camp. I think in this space, policy tends to overshadow the politics. I think we see that with Senators Gillibrand and Lummis working together very closely. We've seen Congressman McHenry and Congresswoman Waters work very closely on stablecoin legislation. So I think people here are really willing to bridge the aisle and work across the aisle to find the right solutions for the space. For that reason, I'm staying hopeful. I think that will continue to be the case. It'll be interesting to watch the election fold out. I mean, because we are in an election year, I think that does have a different dynamic. People are being forced into creating positions for themselves. And I think that can create a bit of a tight position for a candidate, right? Like, you can look at your polling numbers, or you can look at legislative efforts and start to make decisions on where you fall, because you might be asked in a debate, like, where do you fall on crypto legislation? And that's, I think, a totally new reality for our space. Like 4 years ago, I can't have imagined a presidential candidate considering what their crypto position is, but we're in a totally different space now. So I think it's really opened up a lot of opportunity and created an interesting dialogue in our space about politics and policy.
I think it's a great commentary, and I'm happy to hop in as well and continue that thread and allude to the fact that even just 1 year ago, I think the crypto community wasn't in a place where we're as organized and as formalized and as recognized politically as we are today. And obviously, the fact with this being an election year, it creates a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of momentum and kind of like leverage that the crypto community is able to assert, because we're actually witnessing the emergence of this new voter bloc, for example. I know Stand With Crypto is actually turning one, I want to say, this week. And in just a short year, they've engaged with over 1.3 million advocates. They've shown that advocates are willing to be politically engaged. And I think it's unique for a new technology to actually be the vehicle for a bunch of people who may have been politically disengaged or engaged on other issues, or even at the other end of the spectrum, apathetic to this, now saying, because of crypto, I want to become politically engaged. And it's going to be really crucial as you start to look at these swing states and the margin of victory in these swing states. So policymakers take that into account. But I think that can't be the only thing that is paramount. Obviously, like, we do want to continue to lead with use cases, and we also want to like understand, why are these people so engaged about this? And I think the misconception that I wanted to dispel is the fact that only Republicans are championing this. As Sarah and Tara are alluding to, there are Democratic champions for crypto. They might not be the loudest voices, but we are continuing to move forward in a way that is bipartisan and nonpartisan, because we feel like this technology is something that's overall good for innovation in America and can help move us forward on a number of other issues, politics aside.
And I just want to say that from my perspective on Capitol Hill is that, yeah, crypto is bipartisan. It does not have to be a partisan issue. And I think that would be a missed opportunity for the industry at large to let it be shuffled into a partisan lane. I'll also say that the successes that have happened this year in the past 12 months on Capitol Hill, a Congressional Review Act on the Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, the FIT 21 Act, those both passed with bipartisan support. FIT passed just the House, SAB 121 passed the House and the Senate. Those were bipartisan success stories, and I think that we can't let that get written out of the narrative.
Definitely. Definitely. I guess maybe to come back to you though, Tara, like, there's seemingly on the right a very clear narrative of why crypto should be, dysregulated, small government, business-friendly policies, low tax rates, innovation forward. That seems to be like in the right's wheelhouse. Is there a narrative for the left that seems to be resonating with lawmakers consistently, that isn't, fundamental sort of conservatism talking points, right? And what is the narrative for on-chain technology that is working with the left? And why do you think it's working?
I think it is a technological progress perspective. I don't think that's necessarily a right-wing position. I think a lot of the people who voted for recent crypto legislation were doing it from a perspective of they support tech, they support progress, and they want this to be something that we're able to access in the US. I also think that from a financial perspective, because like I said earlier, I know the blockchain is far beyond just finance, but a lot of what's gotten traction and momentum so far has been financial policy in the crypto space. It is an inclusivity thing. A lot of low-income people have been traditionally left out of the traditional banking system, do have access to crypto, and they see it as a path forward. So I think that there are really interesting applications in that space that is something that, if we can look at this from a more inclusivity position, can be a lot more helpful.
Maybe this is a question for everybody on the panel, but I certainly think I'm curious. And for Tara, your take here too. But like, is crypto an existential risk to the government from a policy standpoint? Does it pose a fundamental threat to the economy? Is it a geopolitical risk towards the dollar as the global reserve currency? I think there's a lot of narrative that gets a lot of play in the broader on-chain crypto industry that says that these things are true. And when you guys interact with policymakers, is that anxiety that is present, or is that not founded in reality and just is kind of like part of the zeitgeist or sort of, media narrative and not so much of the policy narrative? Darin, I saw you shake your head hard there. So maybe let's start with you.
I had the pleasure of hopping in on this one. I would not consider crypto as an existential risk to the structures that be. I think that might be a hyperbolic narrative that's out there. I will say that obviously There are like tribes of crypto, right? So depending on whatever asset or whatever tribe we're like speaking to, that might be a talking point that they're like resonating. But crypto is not monolithic in any sense. And I'd say if we're zooming all the way out, the bigger danger, in my opinion, is the United States is completely disengaged and we're headed in the sand on common sense regulation for this industry because we know it's not going away. And in fact, it's only disseminating across the nation to other places that might not necessarily reflect our ideals. So we need to have a strategic plan that we've been building over the next decade or so that incorporates digital assets and crypto and that aligns with our principles and our values and helps drive forward on consumer protections. And I think it's interesting, or at least worth noting, that it's very rare for a new industry to come to the table and say, hey, we are begging to work with policymakers and we are begging for common sense regulation. You see a lot of other new technologies saying, hey, let me work, give me 10 years and then we'll kind of figure it out. But we've seen enough to the point where we're actually begging for regulatory clarity at the consequence of talent moving overseas, us missing out on this opportunity, and Lord knows a bunch of other things that can happen as second and third order effects of us choosing to be disengaged.
Have either you, Sarah or Tara, seen anybody kind of buy into the existential threat narrative, or is that really like not on the mind of policymakers?
I'll jump in. I think there are concerns around illicit finance in particular. I think this is one place where there's been a lot of hyperbolic narrative, but where people, I think, have gone all in on the fact that crypto might be used by criminals for illicit activities, and that's its only good use case. What I think crypto is doing in general is it's creating optionality for individuals and consumers. And I think it's forcing people to ask questions about what does it mean for us to be in a global economy where the internet is king? What does it mean for us to be able to be more efficient? How can we be more efficient? Can we lower cost? I think the options that crypto is creating in creating those alternative options for individuals and consumers and back-end applications for banks, et cetera, are really forcing people to ask themselves, what is good infrastructure look like for the internet? And I think that question alone has been impactful. And I think it doesn't necessarily have the same answer for everyone, but I think people can be uncomfortable trying to confront those different questions and find the answers to them because it is questioning a legacy traditional financial system. It's questioning the role of the dollar, the United States and the globe, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of big questions being asked, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting as crypto has become more impactful, legitimate, reached higher levels of adoption, we're seeing an existing constituency of banks and financial institutions, especially in the New York region, kind of speaking up about their fears about this technology and maybe kind of playing into the boogeyman narrative to their own benefit. And Tara, I'm curious for you as you're entering, this, as you're playing the role of fellow in a New York senator's office, what do you feel like is the balance between, well, I have this existing very large industry that is a huge part of my voting block and fundraising block that, is very threatened potentially by this technology versus here's what we think is fair and right and the right amount of rulemaking to be made for this industry. How do you balance having a constituency that's very vocal and maybe pushing for more regulation than might be necessary versus an industry that is, kind of grassroots coming from the bottom up that hasn't played a huge role in the sort of success of the political career of the representative? How do you balance those two things out?
Yeah, I don't think those are necessarily two things that are different and competing. I think that blockchain technology and digital assets are new, interesting technology that the financial sector is looking at as it continues to evolve and expands. Sarah mentioned this earlier, but there's a lot of like very cool back-end blockchain tech implementations going on inside larger banks and larger financial institutions. I think that the financial system in the United States is so complex and so complicated. I think that that's why a lot of like early crypto regulation and early blockchain policy has been in the financial sector. But I don't think it's necessarily a threat to the sector. I think it's a new tech that needs to be able to fit into the system and play by the rules.
Yeah, totally.
And Robbie,
Totally.
if I may hop in on that,
Yeah.
I completely agree with everything Tara and Sarah were sharing there. I know we did talk briefly about just like a stable coin, like USDC, for example. I think that's a huge opportunity. I think that should be like a slam dunk and honestly a layup that that the United States can take, because we know that there's a global demand for the dollar. A superpowered dollar on a blockchain actually only allows us to strengthen the dollar and its presence globally. And the unique part about blockchain is that you can actually trace the provenance. So it can help be a really effective tool in combating illicit finance globally, whereas our traditional financial system and tools just don't have the tooling to help prevent that 3 and 4 steps removed.
Yeah, I mean, cash is still king for illicit finance always, just because of its untraceability, and you know, we have the empirical data to support that. But I think there's this feeling of sort of like, I don't know what I could do about cash. Like, it's not like we're getting rid of cash. And in some ways, I think we're in need of hitting that moment of inevitability around digital cash. And to your point, Darin, that's the role that a stablecoin should play. You know, something that I'm curious to hear from all three of you is, what do you know, if there was a 1-hour workshop with every legislator in the country that was Crypto 101, is there something that you think every regulator should have experience trying, or a use case that you think really breaks through for them, that would be educational for them? Because you have a lot of people in this session right now, or maybe even listening back to it in the future, that are going to say, okay, great, like there's all these people working on the policy side, they're doing their best, they're trying to explain, but clearly basically nobody who's making the rules has actually used the technology themselves. And what would be that dream use case that would take what is in legislation and bring it down to earth? Like, what is the base of the beanstalk there for crypto? And you know, if you were to close your eyes and have a, you know, like the equivalent of like a crypto kissing booth appear at the entryway to every legislature in the US, you know, what would they be doing at that booth? Right? What would be the on-chain thing that they would be doing at that booth? And how do you think about like what needs to be built in order to cross, you know, we've been talking a lot about crossing the chasm today, about like getting legislators to go from, I only heard about this from FTX, to I actually did something with this and it felt cool, or I got it and maybe I thought it was dangerous, but at least I get it now.
I can start with a kissable use case that we can talk through, and panel, feel free to jump in if you have any more. During my time on the Coinbase giving team, we had the pleasure of working with Hope for Haiti and another technical partner, Emoja. We helped set up this on-chain humanitarian aid pilot that used stable coins to send money to 300 families in Haiti that were in need due to extreme famine. And I think what this is like proving to the world is that we can transparently send money to anyone, anywhere in the world, which already is a monumental like leap forward. Because if you think about how money is transferred in these very difficult situations, it might be a pallet of cash that's airdropped and then crossing a border in a secure way. Like, moving money is very difficult if we choose to make it so. So one, we use on-chain tooling to distribute the funds. And then we had vendors who were also educated on how to accept crypto, and they tagged all of their products on chain. So we could go back to our donor community and prove, hey, all of the money that you used or that you contributed to this project was spent for food, water, shelter, whatever it may be. And for the first time ever, these vendors in Haiti have a way to save formally. So there's like second and third order impacts to that economic inclusion narrative as well. Now you have a vendor who can actually save all of their wealth in US dollars in a place like Haiti, and also just do commerce with anyone digitally via an NFC card. So it wasn't even all about use this wallet and da-da-da. It was a stable coin, it was an NFC card, but in the back end, it was crypto. And what it was able to do was deliver aid immediately and efficiently in a way that's transparent to help continue to grow the number of people who trust this pipeline of funding.
That's such a cool example. Tara, if you could wave a magic wand and have every senator have some on-chain experience, you know, is there something that you think would make a big difference in people's perspective?
A use case that I think is pretty interesting, and I've heard talked about on the Hill, and I think more senators could be tipped off about it, is using blockchain tech to secure supply chains in the defense space. Having like the DoD uses so many different suppliers, so many different partners, that having like a blockchain based entity record management system can be really helpful. These are really critical things that are traveling around the world, and I think having the blockchain could really be helpful in that regard.
That's a really cool example. I would not have thought of that. Thanks for sharing that one. Sarah, what about you? Magic wand. You're at an event, it's a blockchain association, you have all these senators coming through, and they have to do one thing on chain, and your hope is that they wind up walking away with some higher understanding of what's going on here. What are you having them do?
I think what we've had success with in the past as well is when you have a member of Congress set up a wallet and make a transaction on chain. Like just the ease with which you can set up a wallet and conduct a transaction, I think is really eye-opening for a lot of individuals. And I think helps explain in its own right why this is a really useful technology, how peer-to-peer works. Even interacting with some DeFi exchanges or other dApps can be really important as well. So I think even though it's fundamental, I think just the ease with which you can start interacting with this ecosystem can be really eye-opening.
It's so interesting because I don't hear any of the three of us or four of us talking about voting. And I feel like direct participation and democracy through distributed ledgers always felt like the thing. And the obvious civic engagement opportunity, right? The obvious on-chain civic engagement opportunity. And I'm curious, you know, with the election just around the corner, when we think about policy, we've been mostly talking about it from a financial services standpoint, but we haven't been talking about it from, you know, like Tara, you just brought it up around supply chain management, but even, you know, voting on chain has always felt to me like the we should do that right now kind of thing. And there's many reasons for why that hasn't happened. And for those who are looking for a great nonprofit to support on this front, there's the OSET Institute, that works on voting machine innovation. But I'm just curious, like, when you guys speak with legislators, both at the local and at the national level, does voting just feel like this like thing that you can't really touch? And why isn't that a part of the policy conversation here as well? See what I mean? Like nobody wants to touch voting. Like it's something that seems like,
It's
yeah,
like that hot
everybody's
stove,
scared of it
Robbie,
not being
right?
on paper, but yet we have these voting machines, but like we can't possibly do any innovation here. So like what's up with that? And maybe like, is there a role for somebody to play with on-chain voting? And like why or why not?
I'll hop in. I'll touch the hot stove. Voting
Okay.
on chain, I think, is an absolutely excellent idea. And I think it speaks to the theme that there are these obvious opportunities that have been probably tested before, right? People have talked about blockchain-based voting. There have probably been some very small pilots, but there is likely an invisible friction for that actually bubbling up to the surface, becoming a reality like broadly, and something that we're all talking about. But like you were saying, the organization that's innovating in the voting space, I feel like is really interesting, and they likely have some findings about how to do this successfully, and it just hasn't been like normalized and rolled out. And voting is also one of those very sensitive topics. So right now, obviously the window, the Overton window for crypto has been shifted to like, what is this? But there are also still these like opportunities for low-hanging fruit. Like, let's pilot this, let's like study it and see, does this work? How does it work? And come to all the conclusion that like we do deserve a secure voting system, and that this is a tool that can likely be helpful. I think it's more of a matter of when and not if.
One other thing that we've seen a little bit of trepidation, I think, around voting and in general is digital identity and the ability to be able to prove that you're a United States citizen or a resident of a certain state in order to vote in the first place, I think requires a certain amount of technology and trust in the technology while still being able to shield your identity for the vote that you cast itself. So it puts people, I think, in a little bit of an interesting predicament about, I have to buy into this new digital identity system in order to participate, but at the same time, I still have to trust that I'm not going to be exposed, like my vote won't be exposed in the process. And I think in general, there's been a lot like people don't really want to touch digital identity with a 10-foot pole because it gets difficult very quickly. I think individuals right now are fairly willing to give away a lot of their data in exchange for different services like Facebook and Instagram, et cetera. But at the same time, nothing is more paramount than security. And I think privacy really helps enable that as well. So it's an interesting, I think, dialogue and dilemma there.
The use case I'd love to see, Robbie, is how about student government voting? Institute a DAO at a college or university and see how, and there's probably a fair number of apathetic voters in student government ideas. So then you allow them to do a proxy. Maybe that's where we start with that one.
Yeah, I definitely think there are a couple of windows into the mainstream of America. And one is through schools, right? Like, how did we see the rise of Facebook? Is through the university system. And the other is through defense. And so I think it's honestly quite interesting. You know, that's where we see the rise of the internet, the rise of semiconductors, right? Like a lot of the modern innovations that we rely on day to day either came from the university research and university ecosystem, or from the defense ecosystem, or both. And so in some ways, Tara, I think your past two examples are like kind of like we need to go back to those farm leagues, right? Like, to borrow sort of like a sports metaphor here. It's like, what are the minor leagues of civic engagement for the United States apparatus? And it's really like our research arm and our defense arm, and the combination of the two coming together to sort of demonstrate what's possible for the technology, solve some of the harder, lower level trust implications, and then graduate them to societal mainstream adoption. Again, you know, coming back to our theme really for the entire summit, that having diverse implementations of this tooling in the activist space is critical to future crypto mainstream adoption. So, you know, we just have a couple minutes left here. We're going to try and wrap by 2:55 Eastern. And I just want to touch on one quick audience question that we got. And I'm curious, it's a little bit of a repeat of our kissing booth question, but maybe with a slightly different lens, which is if I was working at a nonprofit and wanted to engage with my representatives and communicate the importance for me of crypto, what is the best way for me to engage with those representatives? And what are the main messages that you guys as policy and advocacy professionals think that we should be passing up the chain from the bottom? And I'm going to pick here because I know all of you have good answers here. So maybe like rapid fire, 30 seconds each. I'm curious, Tara, for you, like what if somebody came and said something, if you could have somebody say something to Senator Gillibrand, what would be the most impactful thing for them to start to understand or feel from their constituents?
Well, like you said, it's constituents. Those are the people who can get messages across. If you talk about how your nonprofit, your technology is impacting your community in a positive way, or if it's having this issue that's stopping you from positively impacting your community, that's always going to be the most compelling. Representatives are there because you voted for them. They're there to represent you and advocate for your interests and needs.
Cool. Sarah, what about you?
I think constituents reaching out is great, but I do think it's just reaching out in the first place is really important. I think people have to date been fairly quiet in the crypto space, but when you put out those kinds of grassroots campaigns and really ask people to engage with their congressman, they've been very willing to do so. So just to reiterate the message that people are listening in Washington, you just have to pick up the phone or write the email or letter, et cetera, to express, how you're feeling and what matters to you.
And Darin, maybe just a slight derivation on this question, like if I was working for a nonprofit, how would I expose the impact of crypto to my representative, and what would be the message that I want to send to them?
Absolutely. And Robbie, I was actually going to flip the script. I was going to say, if there are any nonprofits or social enterprises out there that are using crypto to create more of an impact, please reach out to me directly, because my team would love to help you connect with your policymakers. And obviously, we alluded to the tools that are at your disposal: phone calls, emails. Those all actually get summarized in a weekly report, so they do reach your policymaker. But I will say that like an organized campaign has been really effective as well. So there's some strength in numbers, which is what Stand with Crypto and Coinbase and other organizations, Blockchain Association, like we can all help with that, because like we all kind of have to raise our voices collectively. And yeah, we have tools and talk scripts and things to help people drive forward that message. But I will say, you can come in and say, my name is so-and-so, I'm a constituent of blah, blah, blah. And I'm really excited about exploring blockchain use cases because it's helping me reach a new audience. It's helping me save a bunch of money for small businesses. There's something I could not physically do without this type of technology. I wouldn't be able to reach someone across the world transparently, or it would, create X, Y, or Z barriers and friction. And I think those types of conversations will help humanize blockchain and help them understand the why behind the what. Because we all get blockchain, we've heard crypto, and I think they're still trying to discover, okay, why.
Well, you heard it here first, folks, and join us tomorrow for a keynote from the new executive director of Stand with Crypto, the fantastic organization that all these fine folks have been referencing. It's been doing all the advocacy work. So that's tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I would like to just extend a really heartfelt thank you to Darin, Sarah, and Tara. Once again, such a good conversation. Like, I feel so energized. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.